Extra grain taken on nights. No households reported visitors. These nights. They match the disappearances.
Seize the sacks! They belong to the Lord.
No one will take grain while a child starves.
Thomas shoved the barn door wide and a scatter of grain slid out onto the threshold. Suspicion tightened his jaw as he knelt and saw the sacks torn along their seams. Seed spread like a pale rain toward the hedgerow. "Alice," he called into the grey. The word short and flat. The cold smelled of damp straw and horse breath. The problem was plain. The winter stores had been breached, and their family faced a hard winter if they could not save seed now. Alice stood under the lean of the eaves, shawl wrapped tight. She rubbed her hands together as she stepped into the yard and crouched beside him. Her fingers brushed spilled grain. She did not ask who had done it. She counted handfuls instead, lips moving without sound. "How many sacks?" "Thomas, 3, Alice." Her voice stayed level, 2 split open. One dragged empty. She pushed a curl behind her ear, then reached for the torn cloth. She smelled smoke on her thumb from last night's hearth and the warm bread that had cooled too soon. Suspicion pushed through them both as a practical weight, not an abstract fear to be named, but a shape of action. Thomas stood and scanned the yard. He moved in small, precise steps, past the leaning ladder, around the stacked flails, to where the wheelbarrow stood. He looked for prints in the mud. Marta arrived with a narrow lantern, breath fogging the light. She stepped into the yard as if entering a small trial. Her lantern pooled a circle of amber on the ground. The spilled seeds glinted. They looked pulled, not cut. "Marta." She set the lantern down and crouched, pointing at marks that ran toward the lane. Thomas followed the prints with his eyes. "These are small," he said, and then he noticed deeper grooves beside them where a heavier foot had pressed, and larger ones. Someone walked with a child, or left with a child. He touched the larger print, the clay proofing under his nails. Marta shook her head. "It isn't stray birds. Someone opened the sacks by hand. Someone carried seed away." Her words tightened Alice's mouth. Alice measured her breath, then placed her palm over a handful of grain and closed her fingers. "We ought to tell Bran," she said. Thomas hesitated. Bran, the Reeves man, was quick with orders and penalties. If the Reeve learned of missing seed, he might demand a levy or a search that would shame them if their store looked insufficient. Thomas rubbed his palms together the way he always did before work. The action steadied him. Bran arrived mid-morning, mud on his boots, and a strip of official ribbon folded under his arm. He moved like a man who had walked the lanes all night. He did not look surprised. An official's calm is not the same as a neighbor's alarm. Several farms report the same. Bran without preface, counts are low and marks are strange. The Reeve will want a list by noon. He tapped a quick rhythm on his thigh and watched their faces for reaction. Alice's fingers flexed around a scrap of sack. "Strange how?" she asked. Bran's gaze shifted to the lane, marks on doors, small and large, a bundle left on some thresholds. Old women complain of night hunger and missing grain. "If this is theft, it's clever. If it's not, it is something else." He the last words slowly, making each syllable matter. Thomas felt the suspicion change. It slid into guarded anger as he pictured the winter supplies taken by clever hands. He thought of Edda's small head under a fraying blanket and the child's thin shoes. His hands clenched. His voice came out low. "We held this seed for months. We will not let it go without seeing who takes it." He looked at Alice. "We will keep what's left within reach. We'll not give them an easy feast." Alice nodded and moved inward, toward the cottage. She set about the routine that had memorized itself into her mornings. She checked the hearth. She stoked the ember pile to keep breath of warmth. She spooned baked barley into a small pot and counted the spoons as if keeping time by them. Marta hung the lantern inside the lean. Tuan helped Thomas stack the remaining sacks against the inner wall. They worked in the thin light and the talk was short, made of commands and small arrangements. Marta, watch the lane after dusk, Thomas. Marta's jaw tightened. I will. If a cry, I will call. She lifted her lantern and peered down the lane. The mud there held the prints they had seen, child, prints paired with larger, uneven heel marks that spoke of someone limping or moving quickly. Midday found Thomas walking the fence line. He checked the posts where the hedgerow met the ploughed edge. He found a thin woven charm tied to the top of a post, small threads worn and damp. He handled it with fingers that did not tremble. The charm smelled of old feathers and boiled roots. It was not a simple theft token. Someone had tied a sign. Thomas brought the charm back to the yard and laid it on the table beside Elise. What is that? Marta. Elise picked it up and watched the knot. She hummed, a low sound without words, and then said, "This is not a thief's handiwork. This is a mark of someone who wanted their work kept recognized." She frowned. The suspicion shifted again under her breath, from guarded anger to a prickly uncertainty. She ran her thumb over the weave and felt a stitch that matched a scrap she had seen earlier. By afternoon, Elise found Edda near the lane. The child sat with knees pulled to the chest, clutching a handful of seed and a small scrap of cloth. Her hair was pulled crookedly from the wind, and her eyes were wide as a bird's. Elise dropped to her knees in front of Edda. She did not make a sound at first. She only reached out. Edda, Elise, voice measured. "Where did you find these?" Edda blinked. She pressed the seeds into her palm like a secret. "They were in the grass, Auntie Elise. I thought they fell. I thought if I kept them for Papa, he'd be glad." She looked at Thomas then and her chin trembled. Marta crossed the lane and stood behind them. Bran came behind, breathless from his rounds. He watched the child's fingers. "This matches other scraps," he said. "We must decide if it's better to hand children to the Reeve, scare or hide them when panic comes. The Reeve will not meet children with softness," he said plainly and did not lower his eyes. Elise's hand closed over Edda's. She felt the child's pulse quicken against her palm. Elise did not want to take the child to charge or judgment. She also knew the Reeve's methods. The suspicion that had lived in Thomas's throat now changed in her. Doubt moved to protective resolve. She looked at Thomas. The decision hovered like a stone they could either throw or keep. Thomas leaned over the small scrap of cloth in Edda's fist and the charm on the table. He compared the weave and found the same dye knot. His voice was quiet, but he made the choice aloud. "We done wake the Reeve tonight. We keep Edda inside. We hide what seed remains and make the cottage look as normal as we can. If the Reeve comes, we'll say nothing and count again in the morning." He spoke the plan in short notes, like giving commands to himself as much as instructions to others. Marta's lantern swung with her arm as she nodded. "I'll help. I will sit by the door at dusk. If anyone comes, I will speak loudly and call for help." Her tone carried the earlier suspicion into a steady willingness to act. They prepared the cottage. Alice set a pot on the embers and warmed barley broth, stirring and tasting. She measured tiny portions and wrapped them in cloth so Edda could hold them without spilling. Thomas moved the sacks closer to the hearth and built a shallow false stack along the outer wall to hide the smallest bag beneath straw. He counted in his head each measure of seed, as if it were another child to protect. The storm arrived late, faster than the forecasted wind, dragging a low grey ceiling across the fields. It thinned light into a single grey wash, and then pushed rain like needles against the windows. Edda sat on a stool, watching the window, hands cupping the warm cloth with seed inside. The cottage smelled of wet wool, smoke, and the soaring tang of rain on dirt. They heard a figure on the step, wet and thin, before the door pushed open. The threshold lost lamplight for a breath and then gave it back to show a gaunt figure in tattered layers. The figure's hair clung to the face in damp ropes. It moved with a crooked eagerness toward the hearth, where Thomas had hidden the small bag. Thomas was at the threshold before the figure could take another step. He reached out and caught the stranger's wrist. Their hands slid, one to grab the cloth, the other to pull. The cottage filled with a single, short scuffle, not loud, but sharp enough to make Edda cry out and tighten her grip on the seed. "Let go, Alice," voice steady but with edges. She moved between the stranger and the hearth, hands raised to block. The gaunt figure smelled of cold draughts and boiled roots. Its eyes were too bright. It did not speak first. It seemed to look past the three of them, into something else. The figure made a small noise and reached for the hidden bundle. Thomas clutched the figure's wrist and twisted. The figure hissed and then sighed, a sound at once human and other. For an instant, the woman's face, it was a woman, thin as a rind, broke into a look of pleading. "Please," the woman said, voice thin and urgent. "My little one, I do not ask for much. I saw the sacks fall, and I took what I could. I could not feed her." Her words tumbled out. They were not a threat. They were exhaustion dressed as a request. Bran, who had been standing in the doorway with rain on his sash, spoke then. "You should have come to the reeve. You should not take what others depend upon, hear it as an order." The gaunt woman looked at Bran and then at Ailís. "The reeve is asking for grain to cover his tables. I have a child who is sick. I already walked 3 miles. I tied the mark when I thought I might keep what little I took secret. I am sorry." She spoke in ragged breaths. Each sentence was a measured step. Edda's small voice broke the tension. "She brought seeds." The child said, looking at the woman. "She has the same cloth. She gave me some. I thought we were sharing." The child held up her palm and Ailís saw the tiny smear of dirt and the small seed she had kept. Thomas felt a sudden shift, from anger to a stunned shame. He had pictured thieves in the night as faceless and cold. Instead he saw hunger and a worn promise. His hands loosened on the woman's wrist. Ailís kept her posture still but did not move to strike. Marta's lantern light found the woman's face and did not flinch. Bran stepped forward with a practical bluntness. "If the reeve learns of this, the consequences will fall on the household that sheltered the thief and the one who took it. We must decide, hand her to the reeve or share among us now. The men of the reeve will not much care for reasons." His tone made the choice pressing. There were 3 quick lines exchanged then, Thomas, Ailís and Bran. "Thomas, we do not hand children to men who make hunger a law. Ailís, we will not feed a thief and then starve the rest. We will measure and set what is fair. Bran, you risk the reeve's displeasure. I warn you." Those lines came in short, clipped exchange, 3 knives of speech that shaped the decision. Ailís moved to the hearth and reached under the false stack. She drew out the smallest sack, the one she had hidden earlier. The sack was thin and warm from being near the embers. She set it on the table and opened it a little, letting the scent of fresh barley rise. "We will share tonight," she said. "We will give the woman and her child a ration, and we will bury a small cache where we can guard it. If the reeve comes, we will count and tell the truth about what remains. We will pay what we owe if the village can manage." Her voice was careful and direct. Thomas' shoulders dropped as if someone had cut a rope. He could feel the anger ebbing into a new, harder resolve. He nodded once. "We hide the rest under the hedge. Marta will sit watch. Bran, tell the reeve it was a loss, and that we have no proof of who did it. Ask him to postpone harsh measures for a night." Before the light had fully lifted from the furrows, Thomas bent low and traced a line of narrow, muddy footprints with the tip of his boot. A small wooden token lay on a clod of earth where the prints turned toward the hedgerow. Suspicion tightened Thomas's jaw. He did not speak yet. He rubbed his calloused palms together, felt the damp between fingers, and let his eyes measure the spacing of the prints. The torn sacks at the barn threshold had already told him part of the story the night before. Seed spilled along the straw. But these new tracks made the loss immediate and pointed. The central problem stood clear within the first breaths. Seed taken, winter stores reduced, tithe owed to the manor still due. Elis crossed the furrow behind him and crouched on the same clod, fingertip near the token. She did not laugh or cry. She measured Thomas, she said. Short, this token, it's like yours. Thomas straightened, feeling a shift in thought from suspicion toward a tight anger. He looked at his belt, its wooden talisman heavy at his hip. He had tied that talisman there the first spring after Mara's baby was born. He did not expect to see it elsewhere. The sight of the small carved disc on the ground moved him from quiet doubt to a harsher question. Who among their neighbors had reason to take seed from their barn? They walked the track together, feet making shallow impressions next to the child's prints. The hedgerow cut a thin black line against the dim sky. Wind smelled of wet earth and last night's straw. Elis paused and cupped the token against her palm. Her fingers smelled of dove and beeswax. She kept hold of it as if testing its weight. By the time they reached the lane, the village had stirred. Old Jory walked toward them with a slow, measured step, leaning on his stick. He carried a piece of cloth in one hand and a worried crease on his forehead. Thomas, Jory before he reached them. The overseer will want an account. Thomas's suspicion tightened again, now edged with a practical dread. He answered with facts, not explanations. We have less seed than before. Thomas, sacks torn. Tracks to the hedgerow, a token. Jory looked at the token in Elis' palm. He did not soften. The manor will count every grain, he said. You know that they moved toward the cottage with the stolen seed becoming a tangible force between them. Inside the pantry, Elis spread the torn sacks across the table. Her hands worked like scales, measuring handfuls, elbowing flour, dusted cloth aside, setting aside what might feed the children for a week. Thomas found the old tally in a drawer and counted from memory and ink smudges. He kept his voice level, but his hands shook slightly as he set down wooden pegs used for measuring. Elis named amounts, this much for the hearth, this for the oats, this. She stopped when Thomas laid a peg down and looked at her. Their exchange was brief, the kind that rearranged strategy rather than comfort. Thomas began to calculate aloud. If the overseer takes the tithe and the seed missing is counted, we will not have enough for sowing. We will not meet the Lord's dues. He set the peg with a firm press. His words changed from suspicion into a planning anger, a willingness to act. They argued in short, precise sentences about what to tell the manor, report it and lose the village. Elis hide some and feed the children. Thomas countered. Her voice was steady, his voice low and immediate. The room tightened around the decision until old Jory's knock at the door turned the discussion outward. Jory stepped inside and placed his cloth down. Someone saw a boy near the hedgerow this morning, Micah by name, he said. He ran off when questioned. The name landed with a small, sharp sound. Thomas felt his suspicion wrench toward a concrete target and then shift again to hesitance. The new emotion, doubt mixed with a cautious pity, took hold as he imagined a thin hand in another boy's pocket. He pushed it down to hold the conversation where it could be useful. They set out to the hedgerow. Thomas walked in front, Elis a step behind, Jory trailing with a folded back. The village smelled of wet straw and smoke as doors opened and faces peered. They kept to the lane. The footprints grew clearer, where the soil had been softer from the night's rain. Thomas watched every break in the sod for the next clue. At the hedge they found Micah crouched with bare knees in the mud, palms open and empty when Thomas knelt. The boy looked younger than Thomas had expected, his coat threadbare, fingers red. Thomas the boy's name, and it came out rough, a mixture of demand and a held sorrow. Micah, where did you take the seed? Thomas. Micah did not leap to excuses. He looked at Thomas, then at Elis. I only took a little, he said. My sister, she's not well. Thomas's suspicion shifted again into a restrained anger that fought with a swelling concern. He felt his hands clench, then unclench, and the motion showed him which way his next step should lean. He reached out, touched Micah's dirt, skinned shoulder. The boy flinched and then did not pull away. Show me what you have now, Thomas. Micah opened his palms, They were empty but for a single husk of wheat. Thomas picked it up and felt its dryness, the small kernel like a promise. He looked at Elis. She folded her hands once and then lifted them to her mouth as if tasting air she did not have. Her expression told Thomas they stood at a fork, not merely whether to report theft, but about how to treat hunger in their own lane. They left Mika at the hedgerow with a warning and a direction toward the common well. Conversations with neighbors started to gather in short bursts near the green. Old Jory returned, his steps quicker now, and brought word that Mara had been seen gathering near the pond. Elis followed Jory and found a small lean to of reed and tarp beside the pond, where Mara sat with a young child against her breast. Elis' approach was cautious. Mara lifted a head with eyes that were hollow with worry but not without awareness. Mara, Elis, naming her as if setting a small test. What is this? Mara's voice came low. I had to hide her a little seed. The baby would not stop crying. We had nothing last night. She lifted a cloth that revealed a small sack, not whole but heavy enough to tilt the heart. Elis saw the wooden talisman tucked against the sack's rim, its carved lines the same as Thomas. Alice's chest tightened, and the emotion that had run through her, measured concern, broke into a firm resolve. She touched the talisman and felt the wood-wound smoothness. Her next action moved the plot. She took the sack, weighed it by hand, then covered it back. Neighbors gathered, voices low at first and then rising. Someone the overseer might count what was missing by nightfall. Someone else said they could not let the baby starve. The village was no longer a setting. It had become an actor. Thomas listened, measuring each voice as if it were a scale. By late afternoon, thunder rolled low and the first heavy drops began to fall. People clustered under eaves and in the common shelter. The storm pressed a physical urgency onto them. Mud thickened in the lanes, and the seed in sacks became heavier with water and with consequence. Old Jory, Mara, Mika, Elis, and Thomas stood in the green while others watched from doorways. Thomas felt the full weight of suspicion, pity, and a new, stubborn protectiveness. He knew that if he told the overseer, the Mena would punish the household and might take grain from neighboring families to balance accounts. If he covered for those who had taken seed, he risked being accused himself and losing his tenancy. The storm made the choice immediate. Alice stepped forward. We will not give them to the manor, she said, voice steady. We cannot watch children go hungry because we are afraid of fines. Her words drove a change in Thomas. He moved from planning to a visible, decisive action. He shook rain from his straw hat and looked at the group. Someone spat into the mud. You de-risk the manor, Old Jory. His voice held an ache and a warning. He had lived under lords and Jews for 3 winters too many. He knew the consequences. Thomas answered in short sentences that left little room for negotiation. We will admit how much is missing. We will keep what we need to plant. We will share what's left to feed children until planting. His voice did not rise, it cut. He counted names. Mara keeps the little sack. Micah stays. Old Jory will go to the overseer with me if he wishes. There was a burst of low argument, 3 quick lines where voices crossed. That's madness, someone said. We will be fined, another replied. We can stand by and watch a child waste away, Elis. Thomas met Mara's eyes. He saw in them the same tired resolve he had seen in Elis. Mara's choice was the pivot. She stepped forward and lifted the small sack, holding it where everyone could see. Take what you need from it. Thomas, Mara, but bury the rest by the reeds. No one must know who put it there. Give me back what keeps the baby eating tonight. Her tone was not pleading. It was arranging a survival. This was the chapter's first twist, an unexpected link between Thomas' talisman and Mara's sack. Those small facts changed the direction of blame into something more complicated. A neighbor's kinship, shared fear, and a hidden act of care. Thomas felt his suspicion soften into a cautious compassion. He reached and took the sack, weighing the decision against the risk. The storm hardened. Rain beat the green into a sheet of gray. People moved from argument to action. Thomas Elis to gather what they could for the sowing. Elis moved to do so, hands quick and efficient as she set aside grain for the hearth and for the fields. Her motions showed her emotions, worry braided with clear, practical steps. At the lane's edge a small group approached carrying sacks. They slung them over shoulders with wet cloth and pulled hoods over their heads. Thomas caught the edge of one sack and saw straw knocked into the mud. The crowd hushed. The climax arrived with no ceremony besides the storm and the gathering. Thomas stepped into the lane as they came, rain running down his face, hat under his arm. He named the action that would decide everything. Who carries those sacks? Thomas called. A man in a soaked cloak answered, voice tight, we did what we must. There followed 3 rapid exchanges, voices tight, short lines pressing against one another like the rain. Return them, Thomas, tell the overseer, old Jory, we kept what we needed. The man replied, not enough for all. Another voice said, we shared because the children cried. Elis added. The argument moved like a sluice, water pushing one way and then the other. Thomas made a choice that was at once practical and moral. He stepped in front of the sacks, put his hand on one, and said, the manna will count. I will speak for what we give. But I will not finger the desperate to save my own skin. His voice was low but filled the lane. Mara's face went pale. Mika looked down. Old Jory's jaw tightened. The man with the cloak met Thomas' eyes. There was silence for a breath, and then a single hard decision. The group lowered the sacks to the ground. The overseer did come later that day, smelling of oil and authority, his ledger a weight he set upon the table of the manor hall. Thomas stood before him with old Jory at his side, Elis watching from the doorway. Thomas did not tell lies. He measured amounts and named who had been found bearing grain. The overseer wrote, narrowed his eyes, and then ordered a smaller fine than any of them had feared. The exact amounts were counted and recorded. The Manus tally did not match the worst of their imaginations. On the walk home the rain had stopped. Thomas and Elis moved with wet hems and hands that still trembled from the day. The village had shifted. Neighbors avoided each other for a time, then returned to exchanges necessary for labor and food. The talisman sat heavier at Thomas' hip. Its meaning had changed from a private charm to a sign that had connected neighbor to neighbor. By evening, in the pale warm ring of the hearth, Thomas and Elis divided what remained. They measured with the same care Elis used at dawn. Each portion was named and placed into separate sacks. Seed for sowing, grain for the children, a little for Mara to keep until the baby could eat plain bread again. They spoke little, handling the goods like a new map of responsibilities. Elis finally said, we did not hide the truth to save ourselves. We shared to save the children, Thomas nodded. His jaw had loosened from its early suspicion. He could still feel the pressure of the manor and the unease of neighbors, but the day's choices had been made and consequences placed where they could be met. He warmed his hands over the hearth and felt their roughness relax. Outside, thunder rolled again beyond the hills. Inside, the children slept in a small bed near the smoke, blackened rafters. The kernel of wheat Thomas had found in Mika's palm sat in a bowl beside the hearth. Elis had polished it and placed it there as an emblem of what they had protected. The token that had tied Thomas to his past now sat on the table between Mara's sack and their measuring pegs. Thomas and Elis exchanged a look that held the day as facts more than words. They had answered the immediate crisis. They had not solved the coming winter. The final beat of this chapter came not with resolution, but with a clear, concrete action. Thomas pushed his chair back, took the sack set aside for sowing, and walked to the door to bury the remainder by the reeds, as they had agreed. He lifted the sack, felt its weight, and stepped out into the cool evening to hide what could buy hope for spring. The door closed behind him with a definite click. Thomas shoved the granary door and the bolt skittered aside. Sacks were missing, and the threshold showed a clean cut where leather had dragged. Suspicion tightened his jaw as he crouched and spread his fingers over the torn wood. feeling a smear of dark oil and a line of scrape marks that stopped where the floorboards met the outside. "Ellis," he called without raising his voice. The word clipped because there was no time for small comforts now. Ellis was already at his shoulder, her hands wiping at straw on her apron as she took in the emptied racks and the angled space where seed should have braced the rafters. The problem stood in front of them plainly. Winter approached and a portion of the village's seed had vanished from the communal store. They moved without long talk. Thomas knelt to inspect the place where the sacks had once sat and found a faint smudge of leather dust and a narrow strip of torn twine. He pulled at a loose straw and found, tied into it, a scrap of thread with a tiny wooden talisman looped through it. The same talisman that hung from his own belt. He straightened, the muscle along his jaw working, and folded his hand over the talisman as if to keep it warm. Suspicion had opened like a bruise and then shifted. Now he felt guarded anger, a demand for an answer that would not wait until evening. Ellis touched his sleeve. "Someone's handled your things," she said. Her voice was steady and small, and she kept her eyes on the talisman as if it could speak. Thomas looked toward the yard, where the village were often gathered at this hour, and then toward the hedgerow beyond the lane. He remembered the torn sacks of last week, the pale grain strewn like a thin rain along the threshold of their barn. He remembered a line of narrow prints in soft earth from a day before dawn. Those were facts he could name and point to. They made the missing grain a narrowing problem rather than a rumor. They took the talisman with them to the green. Word spread quickly. People clustered at the granary steps with kerchiefs and muddy sleeves. Martin, the reeve, came brisk and red, faced, his boots ticking on the green. Thomas held the talisman up where a handful could see it, and the men hushed. A murmur ran through the crowd as someone recognized the leather smear on the door. "That Mark Marin?" And she nodded toward Martin. "Doesn't he that look like the reeve's belt?" Martin's face tightened in a way that did not reach his eyes. "I keep my belt at my waist like any reasonable steward of the Lord's goods," he said. His mouth made the words with force. "We will have an accounting. We will tally what is gone." The crowd's attention swung like a pendulum from Thomas to Martin and back. Thomas nothing at first. He pressed his palms together as if to warm them and let Alice speak steady facts. Alice stepped forward. "2 sacks gone," she said, the bolt cut. A scrap tied to straw from Thomas's belt. "We found footprints turning into the hedgerow earlier this week." Her voice did not rise with accusation. She listed what she had seen and let the weight of the list do the work. "We handed our seed here yesterday morning. Now there is less for sowing than before." Marin crossed her arms and spat into the grass. "If a reeve's belt made those marks, he will stand before everyone and answer." Voices rose, some sharp, some frightened. Thomas watched Martin's fingers twitch near the knife at his belt. Martin's reply came in a rush. "You would blame the reeve?" he asked, and the word blamed tasted like accusation. "Do you think I would strip the village bare to fill the Lord's storehouse? I keep watch for the village's good." He turned and searched faces in the crowd. "We will search the hedgerow. We will find whoever took this seed. If anyone hides grain, they hide it from the Lord and from law. There will be reckoning." His tone carried the authority of a man used to people stepping back. The mood toppled into sharp motion. Thomas pulled Joran, a thin youth whose shoulders still ate at his tunic, aside and asked flatly, "You saw anyone near the granary last night?" Joran's fingers picked at a loose seam on his coat. "No one I would name, Thomas," he said. His voice caught. "I walked the lane twice. I thought I saw a shadow near the hedgerow, but it vanished when lantern light struck the road." Thomas let the silence stretch. He could feel the village watching for his next move. A search formed on impulse. Thomas took the lead, not commanding but moving with a shape of duty. Marin and Joran followed with sticks and lanterns, while Ellis chose to remain near the granary and speak to the gathered women who fretted about children and bread. The group split into lanes. scanning the hedgerow where the footprints had turned. Thomas stooped to examine broken branches and the flattened ring of grass that marked where a lean to might have been pressed in hastily. He found a trail of straw dragged toward the ditch and followed it with the narrowness of a man who would not rest until evidence finished its work. The first discovery was small, a scrap of linen coarse and stained, snagged on a bramble. Thomas knelt and drew it free. He held it up so Joran could see. "This came from a sack," he said. "This came from the granary." "Who took it?" Joran's mouth opened and closed. Maren leaned in and ran her thumb along the linen. "It smells of smoke and ale," she said. "Matter of fact." The scent placed a human need at the center of the theft. Not malice alone, but hunger and cold. Elis crossed the green and found Thomas crouched low with Joran and Maren nearby. She held the talisman between two fingers and said, "I found this tied into straw at our barn, not in the granary. Someone moved Thomas' things. Someone moved them willingly or under duress. Her hand did not shake." Her face shaped a quiet kind of resolve that made those close to her understand she had already set a plan. Thomas felt the shift in the group's tone from blame to searching for motive. Suspicion had moved into a new current, doubt about who deserved anger and a growing sense of pity as hunger came into view. They widened the search and against a bank of hawthorn found a crude shelter pressed into the hedgerow. Straw peered from torn sacks piled up like a child's attempt at a bed. A coughing child huddled beneath a woven blanket inside. His cheek was damp with sweat and his breathing was shallow. Joran stood with a sack half open at his feet. He had cuffs mud-darkened hands that would not stay still. Thomas' voice came low and raw. "Joran, what's this?" He did not raise his arm to strike. He wanted words. Joran's answer was quick as a breaking twig. "I took only enough to keep my sister from waking up empty tonight," he said. "She coughed all last night. I heard the sacks breathe when I carried them. I could not watch her wake with no barley in her pot." His breath hitched. Thomas looked at the child in the lean, and felt anger, and then something colder, an understanding that made the anger split. "You put a child at risk by hiding grain, Maren." Her voice had hard edges. "You broke the law and put the village at peril." Joran's shoulders hunched. A heated exchange followed, short and fast, with words thrown like stones. "You will return it." Martin snapped from the edge of the hedge, where he had arrived with 2 men. His tone firming into official order. "The Lord's tally takes precedence. The grain belongs to the commons, and the Lord as steward must note all losses." Thomas stepped forward and put a hand on Joran's shoulder. "Martin," Thomas plainly, and his voice did not tremble, "we found your mark on the granary. The leather smear matches where your belt would drag. Who stands to profit when seed disappears?" Martin's jaw tightened and he barked back. "You would accuse the reeve before the manor court. That is treasonous talk among neighbors. You will hand over what you found." The words escalated into a row with villagers moving like a tide around them. The argument sharpened into several quick exchanges. "Martin, see the cut here." "Thomas," and he set his palm on the granary door's ragged edge. "This is not a stranger's crude work. This is a tool used with practice." "You say that as though you know me," Martin replied. "Then show your proof." "Proof will be the talisman found tied into straw at Thomas' barn. Elis, you collected seed last season and kept an extra list in your ledger." "Where did that extra seed go?" Maren called out. "We heard of tallies taken under night." "Martin. We heard of men called to count where no accounting seems to match the harvest." Martin's men shifted. One spat. Voices piled on, and for a moment the argument was raw and personal. Thomas felt a second emotion move through him. Resolve replacing the first tightening of suspicion. He had begun the day ready to accuse a stranger. Now he felt the need to hold a different line. No one will hand grain to the Lord without every pair of eyes seeing the tally. Thomas, not tonight. He planted himself between Martin's men and the lean, to where the child coughed. The crowd pressed close. Elis reached behind Thomas and slipped her hand into his. Her fingers found his and squeezed once, and that small contact steadied him. The village watched two kinds of authority collide: the elected steward of the manor, and the communal weight of neighbors who had watched each other scorn through lean times. Martin's voice lowered. You would refuse the Lord's due. He demanded you would put the village at risk of retribution. Thomas' answer was a measured set of words. I refuse to hand a child into the cold, because this village cannot agree who will give their share. If there is a tally to be made, let it be made where all can see it. If the Lord calls for collection, we will answer, but not while men pick pockets under our noses. The exchange flamed into quick retorts and responses like flint on steel. 3, 4, 5 short lines thrown across the green, wives and men naming debts and old favors, calling up remembered counts and secrecy. Martin reached for his ledger. He flipped pages and produced a small tally book rubbed at the corners. These are notes of extra requisitions, he said, his voice low as he showed the book to Marin and Thomas. The ink was smudged in places, and the numbers did not line up with what most peasants recalled. Elis leaned in and read a line aloud in a steady voice. 3 sacks taken, noted as for Lord's need, but recorded on nights we had no visitor. The book introduced a new fact that tilted the room. Faces soared as people read the numbers. If this is true, Marin, this is not only theft by poverty but theft by office. Thomas felt the shape of betrayal fold inside him. He had suspected a stranger or hungry neighbor. He had not expected a ledger. The emotion shifted then. Suspicion to anger to a cold determination to protect the weak. We will not surrender the sacks without the village's voice, he said. Joran looked at him with a face that had begun as pleading and now carried something like shame. I am sorry, Joran. And his voice hit a note that made some men look down. I tried to hide what we took so my sister would not wake hungry. I did not think of law, Thomas answered by putting his hand on the boy's hair and saying, You must not do this alone. You must let us help. The line between punishment and mercy narrowed in that touch. Martin called for 2 men to move toward the lean. To and take the sacks. Those are to be counted for the Lord, he said. His men began to step forward, but Thomas moved as well, placing himself physically between the men and the blankets. He spoke quickly. You will not seize what the child needs while you keep secret tallies in a book. Bring the ledger to the green. Let every household there check these numbers. If the Lord asks later, we will return that which is rightly his, but not by a single man's private note. The crowd bristled. A hush pressed over the green like a cloak. Then an unexpected voice cut through. Mariness, we will say what we saw, she said. Her fingers picked at the hem of her skirt. We watched the harvest this year. We know what was put aside and what was taken. If there is a tally, we will read it aloud. If there is profit kept by one man, we will not give him more coin from our mouths to hide in his book. The villagers looked at one another. And for the first time in the day the choice began to shift from single men to a group will. Thomas felt a small surge of relief that the argument was moving toward a public process rather than an enforced seizure. The next scene came quick. Martin slammed the ledger shut and spat. You would make accusation by counsel of your peers. Then do it, and let the manor court judge. He signaled his men to gather the sacks and the evidence. The men moved to lift the sacks. Thomas stepped forward and gripped a sack's braided handle. His palm found damp straw and seed pressed hard into cloth. We will place these on the green and count them openly, he said. We will set 3 witnesses from every house. No man will walk these sacks from sight. The 2 men argued in short lines about right and law, and the argument unfolded in 3 to 6 sharp returns between Thomas and Martin's steward before the men backed down in the face of the villagers' refusal. A small twist came then, one that changed how people folded the morning's events into their memories. Elis, who had been quiet and precise all day, stepped toward the lean-to and picked up a torn piece of cloth stuck to a post. She held it for the crowd to see. "This is from Martin's granary rope," she said. She did not ask whether they believed her. She simply showed the piece, and the sound of lips pressing shut went around the green. Martin's face did not fall, yet his hand hovered over the ledger. The discovery rearranged gilt like cards pulled from a hidden pocket. The searchers counted sacks on the grass under the scrutiny of the whole village. Names were called, and households stepped forward. Alice read numbers from the ledger aloud and compared them to what the villagers remembered delivering. When the book's entries failed to match the recollections of those who had tended their own patches of wheat, faces turned. Some muttered that the Lord's man had taken beyond his calling. Others glared at one another as suspicion passed like a coin from hand to hand. At dusk, Thomas found himself standing with Ellis near the granary doorway. The argument had cooled into a tense negotiation. Martin had not yet produced a clear confession, but the evidence in his own handbook made people question the fairness of previous extractions. Joran's family had been given a small portion returned under Thomas' insistence, and a midwife was sent to the lean to check the coughing child. Thomas's shoulders folded back with a tired resolve. His hands smelled of straw and cold iron where they had gripped sack handles. Emotion shifted again inside him, from anger toward Martin into a quiet, guarded satisfaction that he had protected a child and kept a portion of seed for sowing. The villagers gathered in small knots and argued low. Some spoke of bringing the ledger to the manor court. Others spoke of hiding small portions of seed in secret places so families could survive the winter. Thomas caught Marin's eye and saw a mirror of the same calculation. Keep the community together or split it against an admin who might punish dissent. He met Ellis's gaze and found in her a decision already formed. She touched his forearm and said, "We will sow a hidden patch, Thomas. We'll do it tomorrow at dawn. We'll hide it where the hedgerow dips by the wet ditch." Her voice held no flourish, only planning. Thomas nodded. He felt the soft acceptance of a person who had chosen a path he could live with. "We will hide seed where only the children know the stones," he said. "We'll mark it with the old cairn by the willow, so we can replant if spring comes." The plan mattered less than the action. They would not hand everything over to a ledger that smelled of private lines. The village had chosen to act together, and that choice made the decision feel less dangerous than it had the moment earlier when only law and ledger had seemed to stand. Night came with its practicalities. Someone had sent word to watch the green through the moonlit hours. Another household prepared warm pottage for the coughing child. Thomas and Ellis returned to their cottage and carried the talisman and a small sack with them. The talisman felt familiar when Thomas hung it back on his belt, its wood worn by his palm. He placed a single handful of grain into a private pouch and tucked it into the hearth shelf under a rough wooden bowl. The action felt very small against the day's upheaval, but in it lay a clear choice. Plant for spring, hide enough to protect the child and the family, and refuse to let a ledger decide alone how they lived. Before they closed the door, Thomas set one last measure into place. He took the granary key out from where he kept it and walked the lane to the hedgerow's edge. He set a shallow pit and placed 3 seeds into the earth, pushing them down with the heel of his hand and covering them with soil so that only a tuft of moss marked the spot. He looked up toward the cottage where Ellis had lit the hearth, and then toward the dark line of the manor beyond. The world offered no final justice tonight, but it offered small acts of care that might hold the village across winter. Thomas returned and set the bolt on the granary door, turning it twice with a hard, certain motion. The bolt caught. He felt the weight of the day settle into his shoulders. Outside, the village moved into quiet tasks, and the sound of a child breathing with slightly easier rhythm reached them through the wall. Ellis stacked a bowl by the fire and smoothed a blanket over the sleeping child in the lean. To scare. Thomas took a slow breath and placed the talisman back on his belt. The final scene of the day was concrete. A hidden patch of seed planted, a ledger exposed to light, and a bolt set against further night. He closed the door and left it latched, the sound of wood meeting wood, marking the day's small resolution. Thomas saw the figure before he could name the motion. A humped shape at the field edge bent over a sack, hands pulling at coarse linen while the wind pushed through the hedgerow. Suspicion tightened his jaw. The torn seams from the barn and the missing stores were still in the back of his head. He stepped from the furrows, boots sinking in mud, and called out. "Stop there!" The figure froze and looked up. Thomas held his breath and kept moving forward. He had found grain spilled across the barn threshold before sunrise. He had traced narrow, muddy footprints toward the hedgerow the morning he checked the furrows. He had shoved the granary door and smelled dark oil on torn wood. Those events had not been thoughts. They were actions that set his hands to the same motions now. He rubbed his palms together, feeling the old callouses, and the action sharpened the suspicion into a need for an answer. Thomas' first demand was plain and edged. "Why take our seed?" The thief did not answer at once. A small shape of a person, soaked into the gloom, rose and tried to pull the sack over a shoulder. Rain had begun in slow, fat drops. Thomas moved closer, one step at a time, measuring distance like he measured a field. The figure bolted. Thomas shouted, "Come back!" and ran. Ellie stood at their cottage door with the lantern before Thomas reached the lane. She had heard his shout and a second voice from the hedgerow. She closed the door behind her without locking it, hands already steadying a shawl about her shoulders. When Thomas passed the light, she met him at the narrow lane with the lantern raised. Her voice cut through the wind. "Thomas, where?" He pointed there, by the hedge. He runs toward the lane. The lantern threw a warm circle on muddy ruts. Ellis took 2 quick steps and called, "Stop, whoever you are! Return what you've taken!" Her words were a demand shaped to reach someone with shame and hunger both. They ran the lane together. The thief had a lead of 12 yards and the ground sloped, turning the chase into a low, panting business. Thomas kept his stride, shoulder set, breath even. Alice moved with quicker, shorter steps, the lantern catching on the thief's shoulders and on the wet folds of cloth that might hide a child's frame or a man's poverty. A shout came from behind them. "Hold!" The runner turned, a flash of face under a hood. Thomas called, "Why did you cut our sacks?" "Why the granary?" His voice held anger now, blunt and dangerous. The thief did not answer with words. He scrambled across a fence and disappeared through a narrow gap between 2 cottages. Alice swung the lantern toward the hedgerow and saw something caught in the bramble, a small carved wooden token. She stooped and picked it free with a finger careful of thorns. The token had a crude notch and a cross cut into its face. Ellis' fingers tightened around it. She looked at Thomas and said, "This carving, I've seen it on a toy in the miller's yard." Her voice was quiet but exact. The way she said the place's name changed the shape of their suspicion. They did not stop. The lane narrowed to a slit between hedges and cottages. A neighbor's pig squealed in a pen and a distant lantern bobbed. Footsteps sounded behind them. Someone else had woken and moved to the door. Thomas felt his throat going dry with a new kind of heat, anger that effaced, known place might be involved. He pushed his pace. The anchor of suspicion shifted a notch toward accusation. If it's one of our parish, they must answer." His voice was tight. Alice tightened her grip on the token and the lantern, thinking of children and small hands. They almost had the runner turned at the narrow bend when Elias appeared on the lane, lantern sputtering, breath like white thread in the air. Elias, years bent into his shoulders, kept the same slow movement even at speed. He held out a hand to steady them both. "Thomas." "Ellis, you should not be out in this storm." Elias, bright-eyed with the shock of news. He did not stop there. Other houses, stores gone. The weaver's chest, half a sack at Margaret's door. The smith says his sacks are lighter. This is not alone. That announcement moved the plot like a plough moving soil. The theft was not one desperate act, but a pattern that reached several homes. Thomas' anger widened. It was no longer only seed for his family at stake. It was a parish strain. Elias, tell me straight. Did any recognize who took from them? Elias shifted the lantern and wet light blood on his cheek. No faces, Thomas, only trails and torn cloth. But I walked past the weaver's yard. There were prints like narrow feet, and a small token found near the hedges among the scraps. Elias' hands trembled a little as he spoke. Age had taught him caution in speech and speed in sharing news. Elias pressed the small wooden token into Elias' hand. Does this look like what you saw? Elias turned it in his fingers, and his brow smoothed. He recognized the notch, the childlike cut. This could belong to the miller's little boy, or to any child given a toy like that. But it tells us the thief moves near children. A thin rain pressed at their faces. The lane narrowed to the cottage gate of Thomas and Elias. Alice set the lantern on the sill and opened the gate wide. The yard smelled of smoke and wet straw. A child's shape stood there at the gate. Mud streaked both legs. A torn scrap of sack hung from small hands. The child held the scrap like a petition. The sight pulled Thomas' suspicion inward and then out again. It made the situation immediate in a different way. The primal question now stood. Who were they stealing for? Alice stepped forward and crouched to meet the child's height, reading the face for names and parents. Who sent you? Where is your home? The child did not answer with a clear name. Instead, the child lifted the scrap and said, without a full sentence, hungry. The child's voice was small, direct. Alice's fingers worked the shawl tighter about her shoulders, and a change took place in her voice. Anger softened into concern. Thomas, come inside. Sit by the hearth, we'll speak. His words sounded harsher than he intended. He stepped back to let the child enter. The thief shape stayed at the lane, close but watching. Whoever had run was now only a shadow near the hedgerow. Inside, Alice moved with precise hands. She fetched a bowl, poured warmed water to soften barley, and set a slab of bread before the child. The smell of hot grain and smoke filled the small room. The child ate with two short hands and looked up with eyes that held both hunger and something like fear. Thomas watched the child's jaw. He saw in the child's movements the same narrow tracks he had traced at dawn, prints not meant to stand out, steps taken in secret. The house had the memory of the previous breaches in it. Thomas kept thinking of the granary, bolts sliding, the cut leather on the floor, the sacks gone. Those physical facts had already forced choices before. Now they shaped an immediate moral choice. Should they keep the child and hide him? Should they call Elias to bring a constable? Thomas felt the anger shift. It was no longer only heat. Doubt rose where anger had been. He could feel the second emotion shift, from suspicion and anger, moving towards something like pity and calculation. A knock cut the room as small noises. Elias stood in the doorway with his lantern low. Wet light ran down his coat. Behind him, a figure had returned from the lane. The thief walked out of the darkness with his hands empty but his shoulders slumped. He was not a tall man. He stopped and looked at Thomas with a face half hidden by rain and a hasty stitch across one knuckle. Alice recognized him at once from the token and from a small scar. Rowan. The name landed like a stone in a pond. Ripples of recognition spread to Thomas and Elias. Rowan's mouth moved and he said, "Please." He did not finish the sentence. His hands curled at his sides. Thomas stepped forward and caught the man's sleeve with 2 fingers. The thud of blood in Thomas' ears was not just sound. It was the measure of what would happen if they handed Rowan to the law. Rowan's eyes were not hard. They were sharp with a small, fierce hunger. Words came fast then, 3 short, clipped exchanges that pushed the situation toward a choice. Rowan, Elias, you have taken from many homes. You must answer to the reeve. Elias, not now. Elias, Thomas, listen. Thomas cut across, voice flat. Why, Rowan, why the sacks, why the granary? Rowan's answer was a breath child at my door, her belly empty. I had to bring seed for one night. His sentence was a disclosure. Elis looked at Thomas. He says a child's at his door, she said. The room turned small. The child at their hearth stared at Rowan with a face that did not yet know the mechanics of confession. The moral weight pooled around their feet like spilled water. Thomas felt the anger flare and then feel something else behind it, compassion that stirred tight in the hands. Show me your hands, Rowan. Rowan held them out. His palms were raw and split. A bramble had cut one. The smell of wet earth rose from him. There was a pause in which every one of them measured the consequences. Thomas thought of winter and thaw, and the rows he would need to plant next spring. He thought of his wife and how she stretched provisions. He thought of the granary bolt loose, and the image hardened into a simple calculation. A decision could be punitive and leave a body of a man walking toward the reeve in anger, or it could be merciful and bind another under their roof to labor. Elias broke the pause. Thomas, he said, the reeve will punish with fines, and the man goes hungry in a cell. The child will not be fed by that, but if we hand him a bag now, he'll be blamed and the trail will end, not the need. We cannot sustain every theft. The parish will suffer. His voice measured both law and care. The words were a call to community thinking. Elis set down her spoon and looked at Thomas. Her voice was steady. Thomas, we have seed left but little. We can give him a small portion if he works the fallow patch next week, and take him before the reeve in the morning only if he breaks his promise. Her suggestion put action before judgment. It was a test of trust, not a refusal of justice. Rowan met her eyes and said, I will work. I will not take again. I swear it. The words were short. A hand went to his heart in a gesture learned from time, a need rather than any formal oath. Thomas felt the third emotional shift under his skin, anger softening into something like wary cooperation. Work from first light. You mend the barn boards, you help thresh, you sit at table only after you sweat, you do not leave at night. Elias will watch. If you break this, we take you to the reeve. The terms were strict, tempering mercy with warning. The struggle that would become the chapter's peak came not as a sudden, dramatic scuffle, but as a close, physical testing of will on the muddy path. Rowan had come back to the cottage, and as Thomas moved to help him clean a scraped hand near the threshold, the man flinched and tried to pull away. Thomas took a firmer hold. Rowan jerked under pressing rein. Elis pushed between them, words sharp as a stone. Let him not go now. Not into night. Not into a cell. Elias steadied his lantern and moved 2 steps forward. The air smelled of wet straw and human heat. Then the thief, Rowan, suddenly lunged to grab a sack that had been left inside the doorway. Thomas reacted, arm flaring out. The sack's weight pulled, and for a moment there was a real, physical contest on the muddy path. Hands on cloth, boots slipping, the lantern pitched and someone caught its glow with a jerk. The child outside screamed at the noise and then was silent. Thomas heard wood scrape and a light choke of breath. For 4 heartbeats the fight was only motion. Thomas holding the sack, Rowan straining his shoulders, Elis trying to wrench the man's arm away. Their words came short and hard. Thomas, stop. Elis, Rowan, hold. Elias, Thomas, he is frantic. Rowan gasped, please, I only. Thomas, no more now! Their exchange had the quick rhythm of argument in the dark, 6 short lines that pushed the scene to a point where the outcome had to be decided by bodies, not words. Then Thomas twisted, planted his foot, and pulled the sack back inside the doorway. He managed to force Rowan's arms free and, using rope, held the man's wrist. Rowan's chest heaved. Rain plastered his hair. Elis moved to bind the scraped hand with a strip of linen. Her fingers were sure. Elias took off his coat and wrapped it about the man's shoulders to keep him from shaking with cold. The household's choice unfolded physically. They had not handed Rowan to the law, but they had stopped his attempt in front of their door and taken control. They sat him by the hearth and poured him warm broth. Thomas watched each movement as if marking seed rows. He measured mercy with the same discipline. They argued for a short time over what to do with Rowan beyond the immediate night. Elias spoke of the reeve and law. Ellis spoke of children and hunger. Thomas balanced both. Each argument pushed the plot into choices rather than speculation. Rowan's hands trembled as he ate, and as he promised again to work. I will give my labor. I will patch the granary boards. I will bring no more trouble. His voice was thin but steady. In the quiet after the storm's height, Thomas made the decision out loud. We will give him a small bag. He will work it back. He will not leave at night. Elias will watch the first day, and I will speak with the reeve in the morning to record this. If he breaks the promise, the law takes its turn. The calendar of consequences was concrete. The household had chosen a path that tied mercy to restoration. Dawn unrolled like a slow breath. The tracks that had been made in the wet ground led toward other houses and then away. The village woke to whispers. Some neighbors glanced at the hedges, others at their own granaries. The immediate danger passed, but what remained was a new arrangement of trust. People kept doors more closely latched. Thomas sat by the hearth with Ellis and the child, now fed and dozing with a cloth of straw for a pillow. Elias prepared to walk with Rowan toward the reeve's house at first light to speak plainly about the night's events and the agreed terms. The walk would be a public record and a test. Before Elias left, he bent and touched the child's forehead as if to record that this child would be given a measure of bread and shelter that day. I'll bring word. I will tell the reeve we chose work and watch before punishment. Ellis put her hand over his, her gesture small but decisive. Rowan stood by the doorway with his sack, shoulders squared with a kind of exhausted acceptance. He met Thomas' eyes and said simply, "Thank you." Thomas nodded. He did not soften in his decision, but his voice carried less of the earlier harshness. "Work well, Thomas. Begin tomorrow at first light and mend the granary boards." Rowan's jaw moved. I will. Elias stepped forward and led the man away slowly down the lane, lantern bobbing, a figure in a coat that had been his only blanket. Ellis turned and took the child into her arms for a moment, rocking with hands that smelled of bread and beeswax. Thomas sat with his palms on his knees, looking at the hearth fire and thinking of seeds and seasons. The night's events had resolved into a decision that bound people together by work and by witness. The argument had not been layered in sermons or pronouncements. It had been settled by speech and by small, clear acts, tying a wrist, setting a bowl, walking to the reeve at dawn. When Elias closed the gate behind them, he paused and turned back. Thomas, remember the granary bolt. We must board the cut and shorten the loose leather. We will send a few men tomorrow to check other stores. His directions were practical. Thomas answered, I will mend the board. You speak to the reeve. We will share seed only enough to settle this night. The rest must be guarded or sewn into the soil. The words were concrete and final in the way of plans. Ellis set a single wooden bowl on the low table and placed the last piece of dried fruit beside it. Keep an eye on the child. Give him a name before he forgets his own voice. The child looked up and gave a small, uncertain smile. Thomas watched the motion and felt something ease inside his chest that was not speech. He found himself humming under his breath, as he often did when he worked, the small sounds steadying him. They did not pretend the village shortage was solved. They did not imagine that no one else would try to steal. What they had done was fix a concrete consequence and choose a course. Work for seed, watch by day, report at dawn. The thief had been found, his motive revealed, and the household had decided upon a course of mercy weighted by practical conditions. Thomas had moved from suspicion to anger, then to a guarded compassion that would be tested by time. Ellis had shaped the mercy with a sharp, clear boundary so that kindness would not invite ruin. At first light, when Elias returned from the reeve's house, he reported that the reeve had accepted their arrangement in writing and would hold the note as a warning. Rowan must render 3 days of work to Thomas' household under Elias's supervision, followed by a village hearing if complaints persisted. The arrangement would be recorded, the reeve had said, and trespassers would risk fines and labor. Tumas nodded and felt the weight of the village's watchfulness settle into place. The tracks in the mud led away, and the village day moved forward with a new pattern. Men came with plows, women carried water. The child from the gate sat at Eli's stool and began to help with shelling peas in a measured manner. Rowan worked first at dawn, hands learning to mend boards rather than steel sacks. Elias stood at intervals like an old fence post, watching both the work and the men at their labor, speaking to neighbors as they passed. Tumas walked the field edge and measured where he would plant again, thinking of seed buried with care and watchful eyes. When evening came, Toma set a small bowl of porridge and placed it before Elis. He looked at her and nodded. She smiled a quick, tired smile and said, "We did not break our rules. We tied them to work, Thomas." "That is a kind of keeping," he agreed with a single word. Outside, the hedgerow moved in a regular wind, and the child's breath came slow and even in sleep. The cottage smelled of bread, smoke, and wet earth. Elias closed the door and turned the key in the latch. He stopped at the threshold, looked in at the hearth, and said, "I will walk the lane at dusk again tomorrow. We will not let the granary be easy prey." His steps receded down the lane. Thomas sat with his hands folded and watched the fire. The night had been hard, and the choice had settled into a plan to keep the coming winter from emptying more houses. At the very end of the night, when all was quiet except for the slow crackle of embers, Thomas rose, took the little wooden talisman from his belt, and set it beside the child's small, sleeping hand. He did not speak. The gesture was practical, a token left with a promise of watchfulness. He sat back down and listened to the slow breath in the room. Outside, somewhere down the lane, Elias' lantern moved in a slow arc before it faded. Dawn would come with work and with the village's eyes on them all. Thomas closed his eyes and waited for sleep, not with words about fate or new beginnings, but with the simple knowledge that the granary would be mended, the seed hidden, and a man who had stolen once would begin to pay back his debt by daylight. The last sound was the small scrape of wood against wood as the latch settled, and the last sight was Elis smoothing the child's blanket before she too let her eyes close. The morning light found tracks leading from their gate toward the row of cottages. Voices rose, practical and thin, with talk of boards and sacks, and who would watch the storerooms. Thomas stood at the threshold, handed a small parcel of seed to Rowan with clear instructions, and watched the man turn toward the day. Elias walked behind him part of the way, then returned. Elis closed the door and set the hearth. The village moved on, and the night's decision took its place among the concrete choices that would shape their winter. A bound hand, a promise of labor, a recorded agreement with the reeve. No one called the night a final solution. It had been an answer for one moment and a plan for a few days. But it was a decision made in action. Seed given in exchange for work, a man bound to labor and to watch, and a child kept inside from the rain. Thomas sat by the fire and felt the solid thump of the settling hearth beneath his palms. Elias's steps had sounded away. Elis placed a small bowl on the table. The final movement of the chapter was a simple one. Elias's lantern slipping into the lane and the sound of a gate closing behind him as he led Rowan toward the reeve. The agreement's mark already made in the morning's light.